All right, so last week we covered Elijah, talked a little bit about him, and we are yet again going to skip ahead in time to talking about Esther. And so we are actually going to go through Esther is one of the books of the Bible. It's a beautiful book of the Bible, one of my favorite, and what I think actually is the funniest book of the Bible, actually. And it's definitely also worth visiting because it's one of those couple books of the Bible that are really devoted to a woman. She is the main character of the story, and so the the story is definitely worth covering, and we are actually just going to devote one lesson to it. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today. So just a disclaimer to you, due to the length of the story, I'm not going to be reading every single word of Esther. Certainly encourage you to go on your own and read the whole book. It's not that long. It's just 10 pretty short chapters, and they're very good. It's a very engaging story as well, and easy to read one, not really complicated. But I will be summarizing some. I'll skip around a little bit, but I've tried to make it clear through the references on the slides where I'll be skipping around to. But it is jam-packed. One of the things that's unique about the book of Esther is it's the only book of the Bible where God is not mentioned. And that seems like a weird thing for sure with the Bible because it's a book written by God about God and Jesus, and like it's a very strange thing to have a book of the Bible that is not actually mentioning God at all. And because of that, a lot of people over the years have argued one way or another about whether or not this should even be in the Bible, because it's just a historical account. And so I'm hopefully by the end of this today, you can see that while God is not expressly mentioned in the words, the symbolism of the words very distinctly points to Jesus. It's a beautiful image of the atonement that Jesus does, the intercessing Jesus and his victory on the cross. And so we are going to get started. I'm going to cover a lot of ground here. So let's get started talking about Esther and jump into Esther chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 1 and read the first 4 verses before we skip on. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the province, were present. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. Skipping to verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, skip a little bit, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times. According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. She has not obeyed the law or the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken her. If it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. All right, so blew through that chapter. What we're seeing happen here in the chapter is that King Xerxes, who actually is a well-known historical figure. In fact, if you have ever seen the movie 300 or heard of the movie 300, it's a story about a true battle called the Battle of Thermopylae, where a bunch of Spartans resisted the Persian army in a small little section and fought to the death there. And it was a very interesting historical battle. But Xerxes, this king here, was actually the Persian king that came against the Spartans in that movie. He was one of the most well-known well-known Persian rulers of the time. Depending on the translation that you're reading, you might see Ahasuerus. That's another version of his name that the passage uses, but some translators will will just translate as Xerxes because that was who the king was. So he has this big banquet and party where he brings all these officials and royalty and people to come see how great his kingdom is, and it lasts for forever, 180 days, and he throws a banquet at the end, and that banquet he throws in his garden, and they're all just eating and drinking and partying and having a great time. Excuse me. And at the end of the banquet, towards the end, he wants to show off his wife Vashti to the people, and so he brings her out into the space, or he wants to bring her out into the space to show her off because of how beautiful she is. And she is throwing her own banquet for the women in the king's garden, and she refuses to come to Xerxes, and Xerxes is furious at her, and so he asks for advice from his wise men, and they say, well, you should ban her from the palace, divorce her, kick her out of the palace, may she never see your face again, and find someone more suitable than her down the road. So that's what we see happen in this story. So let's just jump right into the symbolism. When we see a king in the Bible, it often represents God, not all the time, but specifically a king where the glories of his kingdom are being displayed and the strength. And so in this instance, the King Xerxes, is representing God here. He is throwing this banquet to show the glories of his wealth in a garden, and it is symbolic of the Garden of Eden, where the beauty of God's creation was on display. And so in this story, we see some interesting gender reversals in the symbolism, and that several women actually represent several men in the symbolism here. And so Vashti here actually is representing Adam and Eve, but specifically Adam here. I don't know if you remember what I talked about a while ago about how when one person is replaced by another, it represents Adam being replaced by Christ as the second Adam. And this is what we're seeing happen here. Vashti represents Adam. Adam rejected God. And so interesting enough, happened in the banquet happens in a garden, the Garden of Eden, is where Adam rejected God, and it's because of Adam's rejection of God that Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden and separated from the face of God. And so this is the symbolism that we're introduced to here. This first chapter really is representing the fall. And so as we know, but the story of the Bible, we're going to see some kind of redemption through the course of the story. And so we are going to just jump into this next chapter here. So again, we're going to skip around a little bit, but starting in Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. Later, when King Xerxes' fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants, selected from the king's palace, and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Skipping ahead a little bit, now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberty. Skipping ahead a little bit here, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were impaled on poles. All of this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king. All right, so the king remembers that there is his wife has been rejected and kicked out, and so he's like, I want a new queen. And so his officials recommend to him, well, hold basically a giant beauty pageant and have this massive beauty pageant, pick the most fair virgins in the land and have them come, and they'll receive beauty treatments for months and months, for really a full year. And then you get to pick which one you want to be your queen. And so then we're introduced to Mordecai and Esther. And Mordecai is a Jew that's in captivity in the land, or has been brought over into the land. And he's not really a slave. That wasn't really how the captivity worked in that day. They were residing in the land, in the capital there. And so he takes care of his niece, or not his niece, his cousin, Esther. And Esther lives with him, and he basically raises her since her parents had died. Well, when this beauty pageant comes around, Mordecai says, hey, you should go compete in that. And so she goes and she competes in the beauty pageant. And it turns out the king finds her the most beautiful and the most pleasing, and she wins and she becomes the queen. And so we see there's this big banquet that's held in her honor. And then there's a little random story at the end where Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate where he often sits, and he hears 2 of the king's soldiers get mad and start conspiring to kill him. So he passes on the news to Esther. Esther passes it on to the king, and it's investigated, discovered to be true, and the king's life is spared by Mordecai, and it's written down in the law. And that detail is going to become, or that little snippet's going to become important later on in the story. So for now, just store it away. But we're really going to focus on the symbolism of the rest of the story. And that is, Vashti was the queen, but is replaced by Esther, who's seen to be more pleasing than to the king. Like I said just a minute ago, whenever someone is replaced by another, it is often a picture of Adam being replaced by Christ. So in this instance, we get a unique Christ figure in this story. Esther is representing Jesus, and we're going to see how that comes in play. But what's also unique about the story is there's a second Christ figure, and that is Mordecai. And so Esther is representing, Esther and Mordecai together are portraying the different aspects of Christ. So Esther, we're going to see throughout the course of this story, this is again an introduction to her here, but she is going to play the intercessory role of Jesus. So the Jesus that is our go-between between God the Father and us, the one that intercedes on our behalf and pleads our case before God. She's going to play this role of intercessor, whereas Mordecai, we're going to see, he's going to play the role of the victorious Christ. And we're going to see that played out as well. And together, the 2 of them create a very robust picture of who Jesus was. And so we don't see any of the symbolism of Mordecai at this point yet. We only really get a hint of the Esther symbolism as setting her up as our Christ figure in this story. And so we are going to keep an eye out for that as we go on, understanding that Esther is the intercessor and Mordecai is going to be the victor. We're going to see that played out here. So let's keep reading in chapter 3. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him the seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it, to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month, and the lot fell in the 12th month of the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." All right, so here's what we're seeing here happen. We're introduced to a whole nother character in this chapter, and that is Haman. Haman is full of himself, power hungry. Really, if you were to sum it up in literary terms, Haman is the villain. He is the bad guy here, and we're going to see that played out throughout the story. And he's obsessed with power and respect, and so everywhere he goes, he expects people to bow for him. But nobody, the one person who won't ever bow for him is Mordecai. And Mordecai refuses constantly to bow for him, and instead just doesn't show him the respect that Haman feels that he deserves. And so Haman is furious by this and happens to know that he's a Jew, and so we're told that he wasn't content just to kill Mordecai for this offense. He wanted to kill all of the Jews. He was wanting to destroy every single one of them. And so he, instead of just becoming targeting Mordecai, he devises this plot to kill all of the Jews. And so he approaches the king, he's one of the king's noblemen. And he approaches the king, and the king tells the king his plan. Says, "Hey, there's just people who don't follow your laws, and they're scattered all through your land. They're the Jews. We should get rid of them." And so the king says, "Sure, yeah, okay, that's fine." And Haman tries to offer money for it, and the king says, "Nope, no need for the money. Just you do what you see fit." And so he gives Haman his signet ring, and Haman is able to write a law. We see a lot is drawn to figure out which day it would be, and so we're told it was the first month of the year, and the second month, the 12th month of the year, is the one that is chosen to kill the Jews. So it's written into law and distributed throughout the land. Haman stamps it with the king's signet ring and his own signature, and it goes on. It becomes official law as if the king had said it. So that's what happens in this story here, or this section here. So let's look at the symbolism. We've got a villain here. Haman represents Satan. Haman is very clearly our villain. And like I often say, let's look at some of the meanings of the names here. And Haman's is interesting. We're told he's Haman, son of Hammedatha, which would, if you were looking at the Hebrew of his actual last name, would have been Haman bar Hammedatha, which means son of Hammedatha. That was how the last names worked then. And so that actually means, Haman means majestic, and so Hammedatha means he who troubles the law. So he is majestic, son of he who troubles the law. And I think that this is particularly fitting for a character that represents Satan. Satan is the majestic angel the angel who fell from heaven. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. So the majestic who has fallen. And specifically, he not only is majestic, but he troubles the law. He's a troublemaker. And he causes all these problems. And so it's even in his name, we can see pointing towards Satan here. And so he's infuriated by the fact that Mordecai refuses to bow before him. Remember, Mordecai is one of our Christ figures here. And we actually see in the Gospels, Jesus refuses to bow to Satan when he's tempted in Matthew chapter 4. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. So Satan thought himself greater than Christ, and he's not just content to destroy Christ, but he actually wants to destroy all those who belong to him as well, which is why we see the temptation in the garden, right? So he's cast out of heaven, we're told, and he is not content just to rebel against God, but he's like, well, I'm going to take all those who are precious to you, the people that you made in your image, your most precious creation, I'm going to rob you of that as well. And so he steals them, and in doing so, causing them to sin, he dooms them to death. Dooms them to death. And this death is their punishment. And very similarly here, we see Haman, who's dooming is not content just to come after Mordecai. He wants to come after all of the people of God. We see that parallel also with Mordecai not bowing before Haman is the same as Jesus choosing not to bow before Satan, even though all the kingdoms of the world would be his. So Haman devises that same plot. It's interesting also, Haman devises a plot to kill all the Jews according to the law. He writes into law. He doesn't just start this homicidal, crazed serial killer style. He gets it written into law. In the same way, Satan, the wages of sin are death. Like the punishment for sin is death. And so Satan causes man to sin so that by the law, man is doomed to die. And so we see the same parallel there. And so the king then gives him his signet ring, which is essentially putting him in command of the kingdom. The signet ring is like a ring with a stamp on it. They'd stamp wax and put a seal on it. And that was the king's signature, basically. And so he's essentially given temporary ruling over the kingdom, put almost in second in control. He is the one that can put the laws in place, is in control of Xerxes' kingdom. Satan also was actually also granted temporary ruling over the earth. We've talked about this in the past, that Satan, he's given control over the world, over earthly things temporarily, because we're going to see him cast down or destroyed eventually. But John reference in the book of John, we see this reference. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world, being Satan, will be driven out. He is the royalty of this world, essentially, for a time. So this is the symbolism we see set up in Esther chapter 3. But let's move on to chapter 4, because it continues. Just a little bit of context for you on chapter 4 is that Mordecai finds out about this law, and he is distraught. And so he tells Esther what's happening, and he begs her to do something about it because she's in this position of power as the queen. So this is where we pick up here in verse 11. All the king's officials and people of the royal provinces, and Esther is responding here at this point, saying that she can't just approach the king because she might die. So all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. In the next chapter, we skip ahead to those 3 days. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace. in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king said, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." So then we see at the banquet, so skipping ahead a little bit, at the banquet, he comes to Haman and him both. Esther asks the king and Haman to come back for a second banquet. And she doesn't actually present her request. So that's just a little bit of context here before we skip ahead to verse 14. So after this banquet, Haman is leaving the banquet that's happened, and he's in great spirits because he's been he's the only person other than the king that the queen invited to this banquet. So he is just so special. And as he's leaving, he gets this big buzzkill, and he's all high and mighty, and Mordecai's at the gate, and guess what Mordecai doesn't do? He doesn't bow. And so it buzzkills his joy, and he's totally ticked off at this point because Mordecai is not respecting him again. It just absolutely grinds his gears. And so this is where he comes home to his wife, and that's where we're going to pick up here. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had a pole set up. So we get that last little verse here. So after 3 days, so basically summarize the story here. Esther is asked by Mordecai to go and intercede for the people and try and save them because she's the only hope. And Esther says, "The king hasn't called me in 30 days. I can't just go in there because there's this one law in the land that everybody knows. If you walk in unannounced to the king, if he doesn't extend his golden scepter to you, you're dead. You're going to be executed." And that's not that's a cost of her life. And so Mordecai keeps begging. She says, "Okay, fast for 3 days with me. You and all the people fast and pray about this. And after 3 days, I will go into the king, whether it's illegal or not, whether he has summoned me or not. And I will ask for him to intercede on behalf of the Jews, that he'll stop this and we can save the Jews, even if it cost me my own life." And then they have the banquet. Everybody comes, or Haman and the king come, and she won't present her request yet. She invites them to a second banquet the next night. And that's where Mordecai is all buttered up. He goes home. His wife tells him, "Hey, you don't like Mordecai so much, kill him. Have a pole set up that's this big tall pole and impale him on it. And get him impaled on it as a punishment and execute him. And get the king to approve it at the banquet tomorrow. Just kill Mordecai." And so he's like, "This is a great idea." And so he has this pole set up. And that's where we leave off here. So let's look at the symbolism. Anyone who enters the presence of the king without his permission is killed unless he stretches his scepter out. This is very interesting. One, because we cannot go in the presence of God as sinners. So we are rejected from God. Vashti is kicked out of the kingdom. She's unable to be in the presence of the king. And so Esther, in order to save the Jews from death, Esther offers her own life as a cost for interceding on their behalf to the king. She obviously is not killed. Excuse me. She's obviously not killed, but she is risking her life. She is essentially placing her life in the gap between the will of the king and the survival of her people. And so we see this interesting parallel here where Esther is offering her own life for her people in order to intercede on behalf. And that's definitely a picture of what Christ does there. But then there's a second symbolism. So remember, Esther's not the only picture of Christ here. Mordecai is. Mordecai, representing Christ, has a wooden execution device that is prepared for him by his enemies, impaled. It's a common punishment in that day. And so he's to be impaled on this. And Haman is going to ask the king permission the next day for it. And he's all giddy about this fact that he's finally going to kill Mordecai and that he's got this plan to kill all the Jews. And it's interesting that there is this wooden execution device that's prepared for him by his enemy, because that's what Jesus had. The cross awaited Jesus. The death of Jesus, the Son of God, would to Satan have been a massive victory if he didn't realize what was happening. It would have been this massive victory. And so Satan prepares this execution on this wooden device, wooden pole, wooden cross, for Mordecai to be destroyed on, to be killed. So we're setting up the stage here for this next chapter, or the next couple chapters, where we're going to see it all come together. So in the next chapter, we get probably the funniest chapter in the whole book, maybe in the whole Bible, in my opinion. It's quite funny. The king can't sleep; he has insomnia, and he would put anybody to sleep, he has the records of his kingdom read to him while he's stuck awake, and that's where he is reminded of the fact that Mordecai saved his life and was never rewarded for it. And he asks, was anything done for this man today? The servants don't know. Nobody rewarded him. So he's like, well, I've got to fix that. So he asks, who's in the court right now? And Haman, of all people, is in the court. So this is where we pick up here in verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have him bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And after this, we see Haman rushes home in shame and is totally ticked off, but then he has to go back for the banquet. And so it's a funny story, hilarious story, because Mordecai is being honored here, and the king's asking Haman, his trusted servant, what would you do for the man the king honors? And Haman, of course, is like, who else would be honored but me? I'm the greatest in the kingdom. Of course the king wants to honor me. So he picks what he would want done for him, because he wants pomp and circumstance. He wants honor. And so he tells all this stuff, like wearing one of the king's robes on the king's horse with the king's crest on it, and have the king's prince walk before him and shout how great he is, and how this is what is done to the man who honors the king. And then he has this unfortunate poetic justice, this twist, where the king says, great, that's a great plan. Go and do all of that for Mordecai. And Haman actually has to lead Mordecai through the streets, shouting how great Mordecai is. And it's this hilarious passage. There is a little bit of symbolism in this one, not as much, but let's take a look at it. In the days before Jesus' crucifixion, so remember, Haman has this execution planned for Mordecai. In the days right before Jesus was to be crucified, he rode through Jerusalem on a donkey and was honored as a king. All the people proclaimed how great he was. Hosanna, this Palm Sunday is what we celebrate every year for this. And so this is basically a parallel to what's happening there before Jesus a couple days before Jesus were to die. He enters into the city as a king, honored as a king. In the same way, we see this happening here in this story. Let's keep reading, though, into the next chapter. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and they were drinking wine on the second day. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king explained, "Will he even molest the king while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. This is a great chapter here as well. This whole book is just great. They're all at this party, and Esther presents a request and says, "Hey," reveals for the first time that she's a Jew, and that her people are set to be killed on the 12th month, and that somebody has made this plan to kill all of them, and the king has condoned it, and that she asks for it to be saved, for her people to be spared. And the king is outraged that somebody would do this, and he says, "Who did this?" And that's where we have this wonderful moment where Esther turns and points at Haman and says, "The adversary, the vile enemy, Haman." And Haman obviously is probably starting to really sweat at this point, because he's just been called out, and the king is furious and storms out. Haman, knowing his only chance of surviving is getting Esther to spare him, and so he is falling all over Esther, begging her, just like, "Please, please save my life." And the king comes back and discovers him crawling all over Esther, and he's like, "We molest the queen in my own presence while I'm still here in the house," and he's like, "You're gonna die." And so that's when one of the eunuchs points out, he's like, "Hey, Haman had this pole prepared to impale Mordecai on out in front of his house. And Mordecai, the one that you just today had honored so greatly, and Haman had to honor him. Yeah, he plans to kill him, and it's set up outside his house." And that's where the king says, "Impale him on it." So instead of Mordecai being killed on the pole, Haman is killed on the pole and impaled, and then the king's fury subsides. So it's great end of the story. This is this chapter where we see Esther takes on the role of the intercessory Jesus. Really takes it on. She is the one that comes before the king and presents the request of her people, begging that they be spared. That the law has already said that they're going to be killed, but she begs that instead it be changed so that they can be spared. We see this in Romans 8:34, where it says, "Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who is raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us." Christ is our intercessor. He is the one that comes to the king, comes to God on our behalf. And because of the price that he paid, he pleads our case before God. This is what Esther does in this chapter. Now, an interesting detail here. Vashti was kicked out at a banquet, but Esther saves the people at a banquet. And so actually there's an interesting literary device that's happening here. Vashti, it's a queen's banquet that Vashti, she's kicked out at the banquet, and she refuses to come because she's hosting her own banquet. And that's what essentially gets her judged and kicked out of the palace. But it's at a queen's banquet that all the people are saved. And so this is actually an interesting device that's being used here. Adam and Eve sinned by partaking of a forbidden tree, but it's on a tree that all mankind is saved by Christ's sacrifice. And so it's the tree is what causes them to be punished, and it's a tree that causes them to be rescued from the punishment. So the instrument of sin becomes the instrument of salvation. And that's what we're seeing here. A queen's banquet was the instrument of sin, and yet it becomes the instrument of salvation here. Just an interesting, subtle little symbolic moment that's happening in this chapter here. Next we see, this is a very interesting detail that I didn't read to you guys in an earlier chapter, but Haman wrote up the decree that all the Jews would be killed. The day that he wrote it up was the 13th day of the first month. This is the day before Passover. This is very interesting here. There's very fascinating because depending on how you count the events, Esther intercedes for the Jews on the same day as Jesus rose from the dead and defeated death. So at the very least, it happens during Passover. All of the Jews are saved on the same day that God saved all of his people in Egypt, and then on the same week that Jesus was then crucified on Passover, and all of mankind was saved. So there's tons of symbolism just within the Passover. Again, we did a whole lesson on that. We're going to do another lesson later on that. But it's on this day, the 13th day of the month, the day before Passover, that this happens. So let's look at how you might count it here. So timeline on the 13th day, that Thursday, we see that this Thursday right here, this is where Haman would have written up the law. So if Esther, if he wrote the law and Mordecai discovered the law, and it was the same day he and Esther had the conversation to fast with her for 3 days before she were to approach. If that all took place on the 13th, and that's the big factor here, then 3 days later, right? So it was 3 days. I would have started the fast on that day. So 1 day of fasting, 2 days of fasting, and then we're told on the 3rd day, Esther went into the presence of the king and invited him to a banquet that night. So this is the day she comes into the king's throne room. They have a banquet that night, but then there's a second banquet, and it's at that second banquet the next day that she intercedes for the Jews, and they are saved. They're rescued. And so depending on if Mordecai writes the law, or Haman, writes the law, Mordecai discovers the law, he and Esther talk, they start a fast of 3 days, day 1, day 2, on the 3rd day, she goes to the king, banquet 1, next day, banquet 2, the Jews are saved. And that's the day that Christ was resurrected. So, very interesting option. That's potential symbolism there. At the very least, what we see happen is that this is taking place during Passover week. So there's not real evidence one way or another if it took place on the same day, but it certainly can be argued that that happened on the same day. Very interesting detail there. Finally, we see Haman is killed on a wooden pole that was meant for Mordecai. To Satan, Jesus' death on the cross was a victory. It would have been a major victory. The Son of God comes down to save his people, and instead the people kill him. What a great victory that would be for Satan. However, the tables were turned, and on the cross it was Satan rather than Jesus who was defeated. Jesus defeated sin and death, and thus hamstringed Satan, left him with absolutely no weapons, and it was on that day that he was truly defeated. Obviously, he's still allowed to have some power, and we'll see his true defeat, or his final defeat, at the end of times. But during this time, Satan is the one that is actually loses on the cross, and so Haman is killed on the very device meant for Mordecai, which is a neat detail there. And so then the story goes on to say several different things. We see this is where we're going to start seeing Mordecai represent the victorious Christ, because in the following 2 chapters, we see over and over again Mordecai is raised up and glorified because of what has done in saving the Jews. So Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. Verse 15. Then Mordecai left the king's presence. He was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. The next chapter, verse 4, Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. And then the last verse of chapter 10, and the last verse of the whole book, Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. And so we see that Mordecai is raised up here to second in command over the king. We see he's given the king's signet ring, That means he's raised to, like Haman was earlier, he is given control of the kingdom. Christ was given control of the kingdom. He's dressed like a king. He is glorified among all the people, and he's placed at second in command. And we see this in 1 Peter chapter 3, at the second half of verse 21. Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and power in submission to him. So Jesus, after his sacrifice, is elevated to the right hand of God, meaning he is placed second in command over everything. And so we see this as a direct result of his victory on the cross. And so we see this as how Haman, so Esther plays that intercessory role. Haman is defeated, representing Satan's defeat, and Mordecai gets all the glory here and is raised up and glorified to this position second to the king, just like Christ is as well. So beautiful story, tons of symbolism in it, and just a really, really neat book in general, and some unique symbolism in that we actually see a dual, two characters that play the role of Christ. Beautiful, beautiful story here.